Sri Lanka has had a difficult past, but we need to focus on the future. What's happening right now under the Prevention of Terrorism Act is extremely worrying. We're seeing arbitrary detention. Ahnaf Jazim, a 26-year-old poet and teacher, has been in prison for over a year now without any fair trial. We also see flagrant discrimination of the LGBTQI community under the current Penal Act. Colleagues, this is unacceptable. If the EU wants to be consistent, the respect for human rights has to be a clear precondition for trade preferences. So I therefore call on the Sri Lankan authorities to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act and to focus on reconciliation. Thank you.
Commissioner, the South Asian island of Sri Lanka, fondly referred to as the Pearl of the Indian Ocean, has witnessed a concerning escalation of discrimination against and violence towards Muslims and minority groups in recent years. Since the Easter bombings in 2019, the Prevention of Terrorism Act has been accepted as a necessary tool to manage the threat of terrorism. However, in its application, it has broadly affected people who identify as Muslim. The PTA provides the police with powers to search, arrest and detain suspects, causing harm and suffering to those whom the government of the day perceived to be a threat. Take, for example, the case of Ahnaf Jazim, 26-year-old poet and teacher who was arrested simply for publishing poetry which authorities claim promotes extremism. Jazim has now been detained for a year without charge. This is just one of the countless arbitrary detentions permitted under the PTA. This counter-terrorism legislation must be brought in line with international standards without delay. Otherwise, we must review trade preferences for Sri Lanka.
The human rights violations in Sri Lanka are totally unacceptable. Unfortunately, the oppression in Sri Lanka is not new. Through decades, the Tamils have been deprived of their fundamental rights and freedom. Today, we send a clear message from the European Parliament to the government of Sri Lanka. Allow access to the UN. We need an independent UN investigation into the war crimes committed during the end of the civil war with the Tamil Tigers. The war crimes against the civil Tamil population needs to be investigated, and those responsible for the genocide need to face justice. Tens of thousands of Tamils families do not know what happened to their loved ones, yet this is unacceptable. The oppression of human rights in Sri Lanka must end. The oppression of the Tamil population must end now.
Thank you, President. Honourable members. The EU enjoys and values the broad and multifaceted relationship it has developed with Sri Lanka over the past decades. The EU's approach towards the country has always been underpinned by full respect for values and international standards, stressing the importance of upholding human rights, inclusion, and reconciliation. The EU much regretted Sri Lanka's withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council Resolution 31 without any real domestic measures to confirm that the government is taking reconciliation seriously, and its refusal to co-sponsor the new resolution 46-1 adopted by the Council in March. The Parliament's resolution points to a number of worrying developments, and the EU has clearly noted in the Human Rights Council in March that the reports by notably the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights indicated trends towards a deteriorating human rights situation, including those of the LGBTIQ community. Parliament rightly emphasizes that security forces continue to apply the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which deprives detainees of due process rights, authorizes executive sanctioned detention without charge, and has facilitated the use of torture. Amending the PTA to bring it in line with international standards was a key commitment of Sri Lanka in the run-up to its readmission to the Generalized Scheme of Preferences in 2017. The law is not in line with the conventions that Sri Lanka has to implement under the GSP+. We have raised the issue with the new authorities, and they confirmed their intent on revisiting the provisions of the PTA with a view to making the appropriate amendments. So far, however, there has been no progress, and we have seen that on the 9th of March, the scope of the act was broadened to allow for 2 years of detention without trial for those suspected of causing religious, racial, or communal disharmony. The issue will remain at the heart of our engagement with Sri Lanka in the framework of the GSP+ monitoring. We will continue our open and critical engagement with Sri Lanka, not only within the framework of the GSP+ monitoring, but in our regular bilateral dialogue. I thank you.
Kiitos komissaari Dalli.